Good morning, everybody. My name's Margaret Piper, and I'm a member of the organising committee for the Regional Refugee Resettlement Forum, and I feel very privileged to have been asked to be your host today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that each of you is also sitting on unceded Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging of these various lands, and to all Aboriginal people who are with us today. Thank you for joining us for this forum. We'd hoped that we would have been able to have a hybrid conference with participants coming together at hubs around the country, so you could not only benefit from the wonderful speakers we'll soon be hearing from, but you'd also be able to chat and network during breaks. Sadly, COVID put paid to this, but we were determined to press on anyway, and fingers crossed that the technology is kind to us. Today's forum has been gestating for some time. It began, of all places, in the Northern Territory as an idea shared by George Tan and Kate Goluboyska from Charles Darwin University, with a team involved in an ARC linkage project focusing on regional settlement of refugees. The initial idea was to bring together academic researchers and to undertake a stocktake of research. It was soon realised, however, that to truly understand regional settlement, you need to involve all of the stakeholders. So the organising committee grew and the focus of the forum expanded, as did our audience. I'm delighted to say that we have over 200 people joining us today. Some are academics, some are settlement workers, some come from the federal government and from various state and local governments. We also have people involved in education and members of receiving communities, and we have settlement workers, and most importantly of all, we have refugees with lived experience of regional settlement. I welcome you all. Now I have some technical and procedural things to explain before we get to the really exciting part of today. All of today's presentations will be recorded with the aim to share these on our forum website. We'll not be recording the Q&A portion of the session, but just the presentations. If you don't want your image to potentially be captured, feel free to turn off your camera. We're going to begin the day in a plenary session that will take us to morning tea. When we get to the breaks, we encourage you not to leave the Zoom meeting if you don't have to, but just to turn off your camera and step away from your computer for a break. After the morning tea break, we will all meet back here again before going into 2 different breakout rooms to participate in the parallel sessions. You'll be given the option to self-select which session you would like to participate in. And then this session will take us through to lunch. After lunch, you'll automatically meet back in the Zoom meeting again before being given the option to self-select the parallel session you would like to join. The final session of the day will begin with a Q&A panel in the main Zoom meeting, followed by some reflections on the day. If you would like to tweet during the event, we invite you to use the hashtags #RRSF2021 and #preparingforthefuture in your tweet. We also have these typed into the chat function. So if you didn't manage to get them down then. There will be a post-forum survey that will be distributed at the end of the day. We encourage everybody to take a moment to complete this, as it will help inform the directions of the roundtable discussion on Friday, which is going to be a very exciting event. We have the wonderful Sarah Faulkner sitting ready to assist anybody who's having technical issues. She's typed her name and email address into the chat box if you need to reach her at any time. Okay, that's the procedural stuff done with. Now we get to the really exciting bit. To formally start today's forum, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce the Commonwealth Coordinator General of Migrant Services, Alison Larkins, who's going to be giving us the opening address. Alison was appointed to this position in late 2019. She's had extensive experience working across social policy portfolios at the Commonwealth level, with various roles, including as Deputy Secretary for Social Policy at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Acting Commonwealth Ombudsman, and Head of the Refugee, Humanitarian and International Division in what was the Department of Immigration and Citizenship, now DHA. As the Coordinator General for Migrant Services, Alison is working closely within the Commonwealth Government and with state and territory governments, industry and the community sector to drive improvements to employment, English language and broader settlement outcomes, and in so doing, maximise the contribution of migrants and refugees and humanitarian entrants to our nation. It would be hard to think of anybody far better to open this session. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that very generous and warm opening. I'm thrilled to be here. And can I just start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, the beautiful lands of the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their leaders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. And can I also thank Dr. George Tan and the rest of the organising committee for bringing together such a wonderful and diverse lineup of panellists and speakers, and for providing an opportunity for some focused discussion on this important area of Australia's humanitarian program, the settlement of refugees in regional Australia. So I'm very pleased to have been asked to open the forum today. So as Margaret mentioned, my broad mandate as the Commonwealth Coordinator General for Migrant Services is to lead work to improve the settlement and integration primarily of refugees and humanitarian entrants, but also other migrants who use our settlement services. The role has given me the opportunity to listen, reflect and work on how we, together with refugees themselves, of course, can most effectively improve the settlement and integration of those making their homes in Australia, including those making their homes in regional areas. We want to make sure people settling are able to fully participate socially, economically and politically in the life of our country, not only because that is good for them, but because that's good for us as a country, and because that their settlement profoundly enhances the lives of the communities into which they settle. The first consideration of the Australian government when it thinks about where refugees and humanitarian entrants should settle is the existing links they have with families and others in Australia. We want people to settle where they have existing support whenever that is possible, as we know that support plays an invaluable role in helping people to settle and integrate. However, a significant proportion of our humanitarian program is made up of people without those links to Australia. And these people are particularly front of mind when we consider the government's ongoing commitment to increasing regional refugee settlement from within the humanitarian program. This commitment has been designed to support growth in settlement in smaller cities and regions, with a target of 50% of humanitarian entrants to be settled in regional locations by 2022. And I'm sure we could have some debate about how we define regional. The Department of Home Affairs has worked collaboratively with regional communities and across all levels of government to increase the number of humanitarian entrants settled in the region. And of course, this commitment aligns with a broader approach the government's taking in its skilled migration program to support people with skills that are needed in regional communities to migrate to those areas, supporting the economy and communities in those areas. So while I think it's perhaps self-evident to say that refugees are not homogenous and the communities in which they settle aren't either, I think it's true to say that we underplay the extent of the diversity of people coming into Australia through our programs and the diversity of the communities into which they are settling. And if I just choose one of the many measures we could choose to look at that diversity, if I choose language, that helps us illustrate the extent of the diversity. So in any year, we will bring in refugees who have PhDs who may not speak English, but will speak excellent French and will have several other languages as well. At the same time, we'll take others who have not had the opportunity to attend school and may not yet be literate in their own language. The first group, particularly if they're young, will have a relatively easy journey. It will probably take them less than a year to become competent English speakers. For the second group, that's a much longer task. It will take them more effort and more time to get to the same point. So we've got a huge diversity, a huge range of people just on that one measure coming in. And then we have extraordinary diversity in the communities into which people are settling at the same time. So just to give you two examples, those refugees could settle in Fairfield in Sydney, where 70.7% of the population spoke a language other than English at home in 2016, or they could settle in Armidale, where 7.9% of the population did. So just to give a sense of how diverse the settlement locations can be. So we've been conscious that we need better data, both on the backgrounds, aspirations and needs of the people coming to settle and of how their settlement journeys are progressing, but also on the communities into which they are settling, if we're going to be able to further improve settlement and integration outcomes. How well do we understand the different sort of help we might need to give to support new entrants moving into Armidale as compared to those moving into Fairfield? I'm really interested in any reflections you might have on that through the day, but at the moment I think we know very little about those, from a data perspective, about the differences. So a core piece of the work that we've been doing in my office over the last 2 years has been the development of a settlement and integration outcomes framework and an associated data strategy. One of the early concerns of the then acting minister, Alan Tudge, for example, was how we could lift the employment rate for refugees and humanitarian entrants, particularly in their first 5 years in Australia. And this was responding to a sense that refugees come and want to work. And we get that feedback, you get that feedback, politicians get that feedback. There's a sense of eagerness to get back to, to participating in the economy. So the minister said, how can we lift this employment rate? And so I went back to the office and set about looking for information about employment rates for refugees. And the best I could find at that point was information from the 2016 census. So clearly having a report card on our performance that we only get every 5 years is not sufficient if we want to trial new things, evaluate how things are working and drive employment outcomes through innovation. So then when we started to look at other factors that impact on employment, such as health, the picture's even worse. We can get a picture from the Building a New Life in Australia survey to get a sense of how people self-report their health status on arrival and in the following years. But we can't find refugees and humanitarian entrants in the health data set. So we can't really see how they are, their health on arrival, or how their access to our fantastic health system is improving their health over time. So we began by reviewing the domestic and international evidence and existing academic frameworks, and we identified 11 domains that appear critical to successful settlement and integration. So, and these will all be self-evident: economic participation, health, language and digital literacy, education, housing, social connection, community welcome, belonging, safety and security, access to institutions and culture. And we're currently considering whether we add a 12th domain. So we're looking at the evidence around that, around self-agency or self-efficacy. So drawing on existing Commonwealth data collections or through new work we've got underway with the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, we are pulling together key data which will provide a more comprehensive picture of how people are settling in Australia. And we may supplement that work with further targeted surveys, particularly around the issues of social connection and community welcome and belonging, which we know the whole issue of connection to community seems to be underdone. You know, we know less about it, and our interventions are not as strongly focused on building that social capital as they are focused on some of the other drivers of settlement. So as we implement this strategy over the coming years, we hope to build our capacity to better understand how well we are doing and where we need to improve, and hopefully provide a better range of data that can inform the work of researchers in this area, so that we can collectively grow our understanding. A critical focus for us will be understanding how some of these factors differ across geographical areas of Australia. So as we continue to build up those more formal reporting mechanisms, we've got a lot of coordination mechanisms that help us stay on top of what's happening. We've got the Senior Official Settlement Outcomes Group, which brings together state and territory officials. The Minister has an advisory council on refugee and migrant services. We've just established a new advisory panel on Australia's resettlement of Afghan nationals. And those groups regularly meet and discuss settlement topics, including regional migration, quarantine caps, how we are preparing for opening the border, the management of the settlement of Afghan evacuees and the future humanitarian entrance we expect from Afghanistan. And so through gathering information from other levels of government, experts in the communities, other levels of government experts and communities, we're better placed to provide advice to government on a range of issues, including at the moment, for example, we're very focused on how we support the new arrivals from Afghanistan, how we best harness the overwhelming community commitment and interest in welcoming them. We've got settlement network officers and community liaison officers the department does that have ongoing engagement with multicultural communities and stakeholders, especially with the leaders of community groups, to provide information and listen to their concerns, and that's all fed back into the policy process. And we also work very closely with our humanitarian settlement program providers, who I'm sure you'll all know, and our SETS providers, as we work to address the myriad issues that arise as we seek to support successful settlement together. So while the government remains focused on lifting the employment rate and substantial reforms that are underway to improve the adult migrant English program, we're also conscious, as I mentioned, that we need a similar focus on building social capital, with international evidence showing that connections built with local communities are critical to the building of new lives. We are keen to harness and better support the goodwill and innovation also coming from business as part of the community. For example, work is underway on how we can best facilitate the role social enterprises play, particularly in relation to supporting refugees to find employment or to start their own business. Thrive Refugee Enterprise, for example, provides business and financial support for refugees, which can help them start and grow viable new businesses wherever they are in the country. We've also undertaken a review of the community support program, which is with the Minister at the moment. The review was a response to a recommendation of Professor Shergold's Investing in Refugees, Investing in Australia review, and of course Margaret was on that panel with Professor Shergold. As part of that review process, we talked to a broad range of people, including a very broad range of stakeholders. We talked to CSP entrants, we talked to their supporters, and we also talked to our counterparts in the UK, in Ireland, in Canada, and in the UNHCR. One of the great benefits of a community sponsorship approach is that it supports a much greater range of settlement locations and is a model that supports successful regional settlement. Probably because the model comes with an inbuilt, with social capital inbuilt as a critical element of the program. In Canada, community sponsorship has led to a much greater diversity of locations for settlement than in Australia, with refugees settling in more than 400 communities across the country. I should point out that it's it's decades old, that program. So we won't get to 400 communities overnight. We're also starting to see the same effect in the UK, more involvement in regional communities through its community sponsorship pathway. We're also seeing that people who come in through a community sponsorship pathway find strong connections with their settlement locations, with 85% of people who've come in through that pathway in Canada still living in the same location after 5 years. And I'm sure that Lisa Button will come back to this in more detail in her presentation this morning. Earlier this year, I visited Armidale in New South Wales. It's been a very odd time to be a Coordinator General and subject to COVID lockdown. I've done a lot less travelling than I might have liked. But I did manage in a slight moment to get to Armidale earlier this year. Armidale is a relatively new regional settlement location and home to many Yazidi refugees. They're a community, as many of you know, an ethnic minority community from northern Iraq and parts of Syria and Turkey. And over 600 refugees have made their home in Armidale since February 2018. And it was a real pleasure to meet some of these refugees and see and hear about how they're settling into Armidale. And during my trip, I met Yazidi migrants who've been working with the Rotary Club of Armidale and local farmers to take the first step to putting down agricultural roots. Rotary had noticed the particular challenge for young Yazidi men who were not yet confident in their English, so were finding it hard to find employment. So they were looking for ways that they could engage these young men and give them a pathway into employment, so they didn't become, so they had a sense of a hopeful future and a way forward. Many of the Yazidi who moved to Armidale had a background in agriculture in the countries that they came from. So I visited land that had been set aside by 2 local farmers on a no-cost basis for the Yazidi community to use both to grow their own food and to begin to establish agricultural-based businesses based on their own traditional agricultural practices. Just after I left, the first crop of garlic was planted, which I recently heard is doing very well. It's a bumper crop in Armidale. I'd also just like to take a moment here to acknowledge the pivotal role played in getting this project up by Paul Barrett, a former Secretary of the Commonwealth Departments of Defence and Primary Industry and Energy, who sadly died in Armidale recently. The work of Paul and his colleagues in Rotary have provided an opportunity for the Yazidi migrants to put down roots, to start building their employment history and to form strong relationships with their new neighbours over an area of common interest. The research on how the local community in Armidale have responded to the Yazidi, which Sue Watt will present this afternoon, tells such a positive picture of a welcoming community and how the settlement of the Yazidi has benefited Armidale. Other communities that you will well know about and talk about today from across regional Australia are also benefiting from welcoming migrants and refugees who are resilient, eager to work and highly motivated. Host communities are experiencing economic growth and an enrichment of local culture in addition to addressing labour shortages. So to conclude, let me just wish you all the best for the rest of the forum today. George asked me to reflect on the issues and challenges I hoped you all might grapple with today. I've given you some sense of that, but a last key question to leave you with is, what do we need to better understand about the regional communities into which people are settling to enable us to help people settle well, help the communities thrive, the communities that people are settling into thrive? What data should we be tracking to help us understand how that settlement is progressing and where we might need further intervention? I'm looking forward to participating as much as I can today, and there are other officers from my office and the department here as well. And we are looking forward to receiving the policy formulations that come out of today's deliberations. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Margaret.
And thank you, Alison. I can't think of a better introduction to our forum today. It covered everything that we had hoped it would and more. I've noticed in the chat a particular interest in the domains around settlement and it would be wonderful if there is something that you can share that we can share with the participants. Now we move to our first proper full session of the day, the title of which is The Big Picture. In this session, we seek to highlight three distinct but equally important aspects of regional settlement of refugees. The first presenters are Rachel Ankeny and Karen Agutter from the University of Adelaide. They will provide the historical context behind the issues we're examining today. I'm not sure about you, but I used to think that history was just that, something in the past. The older I get, however, the more I realise that history is that which we ignore at our peril. Everything we do has context, and there are lessons that have to be learned from that which was done in the past. Our second speaker in the session is Aleem Ali, CEO of Welcoming Australia. Aleem brings us to the present time with an overview of contemporary regional settlement and the competing issues and demands that have to be taken into consideration when we are exploring it. Our final speaker in this session is someone who's almost synonymous with regional settlement, the remarkable Emmanuel Masoni, CEO of GLAPD. Many of you might remember Emmanuel from the very touching Australian story, A Field of Dreams, about a group of African refugees settling in Mingoola. Emmanuel has worked closely with many from within his community to support their relocation to regional areas, and he will be speaking about that which is the vital component we must always keep front and centre when we look at this topic, the perspectives of the refugees themselves. Before handing over to them, just a few procedural issues. Our speakers will be presenting for 12 minutes each. I'm going to give them a beep at 2 minutes before that time, which hopefully they will hear, and prepare to wind up. It's very difficult when you're doing things online. We encourage you to type any questions you might have into the chat box. And at the end of all three sessions, we will have a Q&A time with our presenters. We will see how we go with time. I might read some of the questions out of the chat box, or else I will pass to you to present your questions. I will apologise in advance if we have to cut either the speakers or the questioners off, simply as a matter of time. Okay, now to the important stuff, to the presenters, and I'm going to hand over to Rachel and Karen to give us the historical perspective.
Good morning, and thanks for that, Margaret. There's actually three authors on this paper. It's Dr. Karen Agutter, myself, and Daniella Pilla, and we're all online. I just want to note that I'm coming to you from Ghana country, which has never been ceded. And recognize. No, it's okay. Elders past, present, and future. As Margaret said, this is kind of a back to the future talk, and we want to look at, in particular, ways in which our project, sorry, I'm having problems with my computer. Give me 1 second. Ways in which a project that we've engaged in previously help us to, sorry, I'm going to need to just fool with this a little bit. It's done something funny. Basically, we hear about issues, and it was on the news this morning, about settling humanitarian migrants and refugees in regional areas all the time. We hear many positive stories about being embraced by locals in the community, finding meaningful employment relationships. This seems to have happened in many cases, such as the high-profile case of the Moroccan family in Biloela. But there's also a lot of negative stories, and we in particular in our project have found a lack of community, a sense of isolation, limited job prospects, and perhaps staying just as long as was required. So next slide, Sarah. And if you can put it in full view. Our project that underlies the talk that we're giving today was called Hostile Stories. And in this project, we trace the experiences of migrants who pass through hostels or other types of government or employer-sponsored accommodation. We use archives, popular media, and other sources, as well as oral histories. History tells us that regional settlement is not a new phenomenon. In this paper, we compare two historical moments. First, the arrival of over 172,000 displaced persons from post-war Europe in the 40s and 50s. And second, the experience of refugees from Vietnam and Southeast Asia in the 70s and 80s. Next slide, Sarah. Sorry, forward, yeah. So you probably know quite a bit about the displaced persons, or the DPs, who went to well-recognized hostels with which many of you are familiar. And these are sort of the typical pictures that we see of this period. Next slide. However, a significant percentage of the refugees who arrived in the years after the war were sent to regional and remote areas to work under a strict 2-year employment contract, living in work camps and similar. Effectively indentured laborers, these men and some women, were sent to jobs that were considered essential to Australia's post-war recovery and expansion. Next slide. They harvested food, they made bricks and concrete, worked on railways and highways, cut timber in remote forestry camps, and participated in the establishment of hydroelectricity, all largely while living in tents and camps in regional and remote areas. For Australian authorities, the placement of these refugees in these rural locations had many advantages, even beyond the essential labor that they provided. Housing them in hostels and then remote camps meant they were not in direct competition for the very limited housing that existed in the immediate post-war years. Next slide. The measurable productivity of refugees' labor resulted in regular popular media reports on the successes measured in terms of food harvested, bricks made, and railway laid, in what was, by many accounts, a deliberate attempt to condition the population that was unaccustomed to non-English speaking migrants, and to show the necessity and value of these so-called new Australians to the nation's future. The regionality of their accommodation and employment removed them from view from others, allowing time not just for the conditioning of the existing population, but also for the assimilation of the new arrivals as they were encouraged to learn English and become Australian. However, for the DPs themselves, these placements were often very difficult. Next slide. Social worker reports, letters, and other documents tell the loneliness and isolation that they experienced. The DPs drew comparisons between their new lives and concentration camps during the war, as well as refugee holding camps in Europe. They bemoaned the opportunity to meet Australians, especially potential future partners. As a Polish-born forestry worker wrote, "I long for a human life, with a wife and children as other people. I shall work, but my new life must be worth living." Next slide. So this is actually from a hostel, but it's a hostel where there were lots of workers, and it gives you a sense if you look at the detail. For others, the strain of isolation on their mental and physical health was evident. As one DP wrote, "Sad thoughts bother and worry many of us." A more extreme example is found in the refugee who wrote, "I am working now for 5 months in the wood. I am getting crazy. The woods and only woods around me are choking me. I cannot eat. I cannot sleep. My nerves are so bad that it's difficult for me to control them. I am not far from committing suicide. Please help me." In addition to the isolation, language was an enormous barrier. Classes, often by correspondence, were encouraged. But as one social worker noted, attempts to have social gatherings in rural towns such as Tailem Bend and Narracute, where there are large numbers of new Australians, fell through because of lack of understanding on both sides, with the language barrier appearing to have been the stumbling block. What is evident is that when local populations reached out to welcome and help new arrivals, there were fewer reports of problems such as excessive alcohol consumption. We find evidence of gratitude from refugees, such as a public thank you in the Port Lincoln Times to Mr. Dan Vaughan for his many kind acts and services. Social work reports highlight the positive results, as in Mount Gambier, where the Catholic and Lutheran churches made considerable efforts to make DPs welcome and invite them to dances and sports such as basketball, tennis, and soccer. Similarly, the Lutheran minister and Catholic priest in Bordertown visited railway camps every week to hold services, and a local farmer picked men up and took them to dances, the cinema, and other social events each weekend. So now, next slide. I want to go forward to our second example, which comes from the 1980s, when over 70 refugees arrived from across Southeast Asia, mostly from Vietnam. Unlike the DPs, these refugees did not have compulsory work contracts, nor was they lived closely controlled. Many did reside in government-run hostels such as Pennington, pictured here. The Commonwealth government established Community Refugee Resettlement Scheme, CRSS, in 1979, which enabled community organizations to sponsor refugees and move them directly into community. The aim of the scheme was to achieve a more widespread settlement of refugees, including regional and rural areas, and was related to the idea of dispersing refugees to avoid adverse reactions by Australians to newcomers. Refugees were carefully selected and were said to need English language and qualification above the ordinary to settle in quickly. There does seem to have been an underlying expectation that many or most would move to cities later, but having a positive experience in the initial period was viewed as extremely important. Over time, the scheme was restricted to larger towns and cities because of problems with support services. In regional South Australia, services for appropriate medical treatment, as well as English language tuition, translation, counseling, and accessible transport were largely not available. Next slide. The reception of these migrants in the local communities was mixed. This is, again, what we see at the hostels, and this was largely not available in the regional areas. The government did put in a great deal of effort to try and sell the scheme to the Australian public more generally. Next slide. The first 14 arrivals to Whyalla in February of 1980 were featured in Four Corners. In a media statement, the government department stated that refugees from the camps arriving in Australia are prepared to accept any employment at all. They're trying to reassure the general public that they're not stealing jobs. There remained considerable opposition, particularly given high employment rates. And similar to the earlier period, there were issues with single men living in regional towns, including fighting, alcohol, and gambling. The police in Whyalla were sympathetic and did note the offenses committed by Vietnamese migrants were no greater than those in the general community, but still expressed concerns about the effects of unemployment, especially if refugees continued to be sponsored. Next slide. The regional settlement scheme was a good option for some, young couples and young men, and in locations like Mount Gambier and Whyalla, which had opportunities for employment and good services. But there was continued discrimination. As one refugee put it, "I don't know why they won't employ us." Next slide. By the beginning of 1982, there's a marked drift of refugees away from smaller places like Cleve and Renmark, in contrast to Whyalla and Mount Gambier, which were bigger and where strong refugee communities had developed. A general trend to leave the regions was noticeable due to lack of employment. In interviews from this period, many of the refugees who initially settled in regional locations indicated they meant to use these locations as a starting place, but their goal was to live permanently in Adelaide, Melbourne, and Sydney, where friends and family had settled. So just some conclusions. Through both of these historical periods, we see common themes. In particular, there are clear parallels in the problems: feelings of isolation, inability of local authorities to provide essential services, language barriers, difficulties finding appropriate work, and social and cultural differences as compared to the local population. In the earlier period, we see dispersal occurring explicitly to build workforces where they were needed, and probably implicitly in the later period. In the later period, this kind of dispersal was aimed to ease settlement through sponsorship by locals. However, layered on top of these rationales were desires to, quote, hide migrants till they made good, and to break down their tendencies to cluster, quote unquote, with those from their own ethnic groups, which was thought to be an unfortunate, undesirable outcome. Fast forward to the present. In more recent years, governments have argued that migrant and refugee dispersal policies are practical solutions for urban housing issues, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney. Meanwhile, regional towns have actively pursued the settlement of refugees to satisfy labor needs and as a means to revitalize towns that are suffering from population decline. Settling new arrivals in less culturally diverse and less populated areas can speed up so-called integration and enable these areas to share in documented economic, cultural, and social benefits that migrants can bring. The small sizes of regional towns makes interactions between refugees and local residents part of everyday life, and growing familiarity with diversity is said to be an important step. Next slide. However, migration scholars in Australia and elsewhere have argued dispersal policies also play into forestalling social problems and appeasing fears about being swamped by others. As in the past, they help address labor shortages, but primarily through low-skill, low-status, low-paid, and often inappropriate jobs that are not aligned with their own skills. Hence, many refugees, both now and then, can be viewed as doubly victimized, displaced from their homelands, often under horrific circumstances, and placed in rural areas without a real choice, without adequate services and support networks. So we want to learn a few things from this history. Humanitarian refugees are not homogeneous in their needs, values, and goals, nor are all regional towns alike, and this group knows that. Whether regional settlement makes sense for any particular refugee or her family depends on a range of factors and any attributes of the settlement location. Most importantly, we need to carefully consider the agency of refugees and increase their abilities to make their choices. And this is a key difference in the historical episodes we just recounted. The Vietnamese refugees of the 70s and 80s tended not to feel trapped and to see regional settlement as a stepping stone to achieving their goals, in contrast to the DPs. Hence, we need to view refugees as individuals who will use their knowledge, experience, networks, and agency when making decisions about their futures. They're people with histories, identities, hopes, and aspirations who should be treated as collaborative partners in the process rather than objects who need to be settled. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to, without any further ado, pass over to Aleem Ali for his presentation.
Hello, thank you, Margaret, and thank you to Rachel for the excellent historical perspective and overview. Let me just click share. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that, here we go, I'm joining you from Yagara country, otherwise known as Brisbane, and I pay respect to elders past and present, and I recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this significant event. Welcoming Australia is a national not-for-profit organisation, and one of our key initiatives, Welcoming Cities, was founded nearly 6 years ago through the ongoing support of the Scanlon Foundation, a national philanthropic organisation with a focus on social cohesion and multiculturalism. To the big picture. So we live in a world in which the stark reality is that the forced displacement of people due to political unrest and climate change will only increase. In April this year, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees released data showing that the number of people displaced by climate change-related disasters since 2010 has risen to 21.5 million, and that 260 million people living in coastal areas are at high risk of rising sea levels, 90% of whom are from poor developing countries and small island states. And so, for example, in Bangladesh, it's predicted that 17% of the country will be submerged by the rise in sea levels by 2050, and 20 million people living there will lose their homes. The Institute for Economics and Peace, based out of Sydney, predicts that at least 1.2 billion people could be displaced by climate-related events by 2050. This is not insignificant. And Australia is neither immune from these challenges or absolved from addressing them. First Nations justice in a settler colonial nation founded on the lie of terra nullius is a high priority and in no way unrelated to the issue of refugee settlement. First Peoples are generally one of the strongest supporters of refugee and asylum seeker rights because they understand and daily live with the reality and impacts of dispossession. Their ongoing struggle for sovereignty is aligned to and tied to the rights of people seeking safety and belonging. We're also a nation of polarised and divergent narratives on a range of issues, one of which is population and economic disparity. Communities across Australia continue to grapple with one of two disparate stories, either rapid urbanisation and growth, which is indicated by the blue, and admittedly, as Alison noted, some of this data is still tied to 2016 ABS, but still reasonably accurate about in terms of what's going on. And those 55% of local government areas are trying to advance social cohesion and economic participation amid growing cultural diversity, or alternatively, population stagnation and economic decline, and the challenge of attracting and retaining migrants and newcomers, which broadly speaking is often related to the challenge of regional, rural and remote communities. And so knowing all this, regional refugee settlement makes absolutely good sense. And so you'll hear from various researchers and practitioners throughout this forum on what hasn't worked, what is working, and what contributes to settlement success. And regional migration approaches are increasingly less ad hoc. There is a growing realisation, there's a growing body of work and understanding that industry-centric approaches and or tinkering with legislation hasn't delivered sustainable outcomes, but rather a whole of community approach is what is required. And so there are numerous building blocks and success factors that no doubt Emmanuel will talk to. There are complementary but sometimes quite different policy and operational scenarios. And so whether that's skilled migration, which is often about demand-driven economic growth, whether that's humanitarian settlement and the vital importance of regions of welcome, and whether that's about the attraction and the growth of diverse communities, each scenario often requires different considerations and different responses, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. However, there is a growing body of examples of positive settlement outcomes to draw on. Again, as Alison noted, social capital is vital. Social connectedness is an absolutely vital requirement. And so to give a brief example, Wagga Wagga City Council, along with funding from Multiple New South Wales, has been supporting a program called Common Threads, which is being delivered by the Multicultural Council of Wagga Wagga, Wellways and the New South Wales Service for the Treatment and Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma Survivors. Pre-lockdown, 71 women from 14 different cultural backgrounds participated in weekly sessions focused on reducing the social isolation experienced by recently arrived migrants, refugees and people seeking asylum to the Wagga Wagga community. And so they were involved in building social networks, diverse skills, practicing social English, developing products that could be sold at local markets, which has then generated a whole range of opportunities and outcomes. One participant, originally from Afghanistan, shared that they heard about a job through one of the people involved in the program, which was being advertised at a local shop. And her newfound confidence and increased social networks and improved social English gave her the confidence to apply for the job, to interview for the job, and she was successfully offered the job. And so this is just one very small snippet amid thousands of stories in regional communities and across this continent. And underpinning programs such as Common Threads are numerous partnerships and planning processes. And so through the support of the Queensland Government Multicultural Affairs and in partnership with Monash University, we've tested and developed a set of guidelines for developing approaches to this work. And so knowing that there's a worker shortage or that the population is ageing is certainly a starting point or an entry point, but it doesn't suddenly birth initiatives such as Common Threads. And communities really need to be able to articulate a clearly defined migration strategy. And so these guidelines are framed around three clear and quite straightforward steps: assessment, consultation, and planning. And so assessment guides a local council and community through data collection, stakeholder mapping, understanding broad opportunities and risks. Consultation then moves that desktop research and mapping process outward into the community and can include community conversations, consultations with migrant and multicultural organisations, identifying local champions, supporters and resources. And then both those steps inform the planning framework and the development of a welcoming strategy and plan. And so we've been seeing quite significant advancement and success. A number of LGAs in southwest Queensland and now also the Riverina and Murray regions in New South Wales. And one of the clear outcomes has been the development of contextualised welcoming plans that frame the steps that communities can take in practically advancing regional settlement. Data and evidence is obviously a vital and important part of the process, an initial assessment that needs to then be tested by on-the-ground community consultation, which then informs an assessment of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and risks that consider all the settlement success factors in relation to housing, employment, community sentiment, transport, health, education, entertainment, food, etc., etc. We find that working in silos and isolation is really the primary enemy of developing and advancing a migration strategy. Consequently, one of our core values and something that a welcoming Australia requires is relationship and partnership. And so we recognise that of all tiers of government, local councils really understand the complexity and nuance of their community, and they're really in an excellent position to be that facilitator and broker and to bring all the stakeholders to the table. Which is why it's important that they receive the support and the resources to play that role well. And we do that across 4 key areas: knowledge sharing, partnership development, celebrating success by documenting case studies, sharing resources and recognising the great work that councils and communities are already leading, and supporting councils through the Welcoming Cities standard benchmarking and accreditation process. What we know about social cohesion is that it's the #1 indicator of community resilience. So communities respond and recover from change, challenging circumstances and disaster when social cohesion is high. And so we're finding that the Welcoming City Standard is a critical tool in planning, benchmarking and improvement that is beginning to ensure the retention of people in communities and embedding welcoming and inclusion practices. There's currently 66 councils who are members of the Welcoming Cities Network across Australia, representing 40% of the Australian population, and they're a mix of capital cities, city and urban fringe councils, large regional centres and rural communities, and more than 30% of Welcoming Cities members are now regional or rural councils. I'll close on this slide, and I'll close with a question and an observation on the trajectory from welcoming to belonging. My question is this: when we say settlement or integration or social cohesion, what do we really mean by those terms? Do we mean assimilation or do we mean belonging? The front end of this work is welcoming and then inclusion, and so establishing environments, communications and infrastructure in communities that both takes the community on the journey and ensures that people are welcome and included. Moving the receiving community from fearful to tolerant to welcoming is a really important part of the process, but that's only part of the story. John A. Powell from the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California talks about the 4 elements of belonging, of which welcoming, element 3 on that slide, care, love and empathy, is only one aspect. And so we need to activate the other elements: agency, power, responsibility, which lead to belonging for people of all backgrounds. So thank you. Thank you for being part of this work. Thank you for supporting this work. Thank you for driving and leading it. Leadership matters. And so your commitment to advancing communities where people of all backgrounds have equal opportunity to belong and contribute and thrive is absolutely vital.
Thank you so much, Aleem. That was a really inspiring place to conclude your very important presentation, and hopefully people will bear this in mind throughout the rest of the day. The final speaker in this session is Emmanuel Musoni. So Emmanuel, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Emmanuel.
Yes, Emmanuel,
thank you.
We can hear you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, everyone, for attending. like the previous speakers, I would like to acknowledge the Darga people, the traditional custodians of the land I am on today, and I would like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Again, thank you, everyone. I'm really very happy and impressed by the community here present who support the regional migration initiative. I wish I would have seen similar big number of people in this area in 2016 when we began, 2015 when we began this journey of regional settlement in GLAPD. And so today I'm pleased to present on Reconnecting to the Peaceful Past, the journey of refugee-led initiative to regional settlement. As I will go forward, I would like also to say that, as I mentioned 5 years ago, it was difficult to find myself in the middle of a huge problem with less knowledge about how to resolve it. A problem of the people who were hungry for change of a lifestyle, especially wanting to fit their grounds, to fit their background in the new land, which is Australia. Crystal, there are such problems. It is very common for people to think that when refugees come to Australia, life is just a paradise. I could say that it's just a paradise for probably very few, and relatively to how every individual is being able to put their feet on the ground. In the case of GLAPD, the regional settlement started at the crossroad of issues in our former refugee communities 7 years ago. Most of these issues were related to unemployment, inability of the former refugees to see themselves through the future in Australia, a need to practice farming, a great deal of childhood projects hanging in their minds. In trying to interrogate these issues by then, we organized the community consultations, and our findings pointed out to employment, and employment that relates to regional lifestyle for the majority of those we consulted. In view of the above, can I say that our humble beginning of regional settlement emanated from a natural experience without any reference whatsoever to an existing regional settlement program when we started our regional settlement in 2016. We inquired from various stakeholders by then in the settlement sector, including the very big organizations, SSI, Department of Social Services, but we were unable to get someone pointing us to the organizations that were practicing regional settlement by then for a period of 2 years. Nonetheless, later in the process, we miraculously connected to our first regional settlement opportunity by the Department of Social Services, together with the federal member for New England, Honorable Barnaby Joyce, by then. With or without any guidance on how to connect regional Australia, our organization was determined to pursue the will of our communities. Thus, we were energized by the results of the community consultations that we organized in 2015 and 2016, which pointed out to that part, that the big part of our communities wanted to practice farming and live a lifestyle that necessitates places other than Sydney City. Thus, we set off to constant inquiries with a view of connecting to at least one community in regional areas that may be willing to welcome refugees from the Great Lakes of Africa. Since then, I developed a community profile of the people from the Great Lakes of Africa to be able to sell it to the regional communities and press on with inquiries. By the end of 2015, we were connected to the first settlement in New South Wales and moved the 3 families to the regional community, which is Mingura. As we emerged from consultations with refugees, the findings, as we emerged from consultations with refugees to finding the first regional community willing to welcome refugee families, we informed the families and requested them to inspect the first regional community of Mingura to ascertain whether or not they were happy to move in that community.
Sorry to interrupt you, Emmanuel, but would you mind putting your slides in presenter view just so we could follow along with you? It seems to be frozen just on slide 2.
Sorry.
No, that's quite all right. If you have any trouble, just let me know.
Yeah, sure. Let me move it then. Sorry.
Yeah, just go up to the top and click, go up to the top and click slideshow on the toolbar on the top there.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm.
That's okay. We'll just follow you through this format. That's quite all right. Thank you. Continue with what you were saying.
Well, thank you so much. Or else you can put it up for me, please. Sorry about that. Let me. On the ground in Mingura, I caught one of the refugees stepping out of the vehicle and holding a stick on his shoulder and went in the middle of the cows on the farm and said, "I'm home now, even if you leave me here." Eventually, refugees settled in Mingura and they were happy to live in that rural community, notwithstanding the effects of the long drought that happened in New South Wales in the recent past. This drought hit hard rural areas that depended on agriculture, such as Mingura, while towns that were more diverse with other sources of employment thrived a little better. Let me borrow the words of a good writer, Winston Churchill, who said that to improve is to change, thus to be perfect is to change quite often. Therefore, in the subsequent settlements in regional areas, the learnings of Mingura necessitated us to improve our mode of choice in the next settlements in towns, which embraced both rural agriculture as well as other jobs. On the establishment of the model, in 2018, I was requested by 3 organizations, Regional Australian Institute, Scanlon Foundation, and Welcoming Cities, to put together a toolkit which Aleem has spoken about. At the end of this work, I developed a 3-step model that structured the process of regional settlement from the back end to the forward end of regional settlement. The process is a 3-step model which includes pre-settlement, settlement stage, and post-settlement stages. At each level, there's a number of activities that supports the individual or the community to be able to settle in regional areas. The strength of this model is in its original nature, which reflects the hands-on experience of GLAPD that went through from the onset of the program through failures, lessons learned, as well as success stories, and the learnings from this process has formed a model through numerous changes to adopt to the best style. The benchmarking of choice-based strategy enshrined in the 3 steps model. Such regional areas has its roots in the primary stage of identifying that is who have their heart and minds in the regional areas. Second is to match the desire of the refugees who want to move to regional areas with the place-based choice. Place-based choice is an element of decision-making that relates to the childhood home of peace. The home of peace is that place where one grew up and had a great inspiration before wars and conflicts devastated their peaceful villages. Even if those places were left in the midst of ashes, tears, and blood, it remains the peaceful hanging place of ideal that is in the minds of many refugees, incomparable with little to no other place on the planet. Nonetheless, some of the refugees, there is hope in mind that one day they will find a place like home. Thus, the place of choice has formed our model from the onset of initiated settlement project in the regional areas. Because we are certain that once a group of refugees from cities choose a town that have similar geographical and environmental features as those in their peaceful home village, they will settle forever. That's why the pre-settlement stage of our model is the most strategic to determine the right fit for sustainable regional settlement. In our quest to validate this aspect of choice-based strategy and reconnecting to the peaceful past as a basis of sustainable settlement in regional areas, we've done periodic observations on different settlement areas in New South Wales and Queensland. For instance, the settlement we have in Kara, I organized the refugees to visit the cities of Bathurst, Orange, Dubbo, Parkes, Forbes, Kara, and Young. But at the end of the journey, the refugees decided to settle in Kara, which looks a bit smaller economically and probably in accessibility compared to the rest of the towns that refugees have discovered. But what I noticed, what I observed with the refugees when we arrived in Kara was that some of them are naming some of the hills in Kara, the names of the hills and villages back home. And others were saying that it feels peaceful. And others saying, I can't imagine having my cows on this hill. So there was that great connect between where they came from and where they decided to settle in regional New South Wales. Similar examples have happened to Queensland as well as Dubbo and Taree, where we settled refugees and migrants. Excitingly, one of the successful achievements of the combination of choice-based strategy that is attached on the connection to the peaceful past and the 3-step model is that 90% of our settlements have sustainably stayed in regional areas. However, behind every successful story, there are challenges. The greatest challenge, I can say that the greatest glory of in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall, which was said by Nelson Mandela. There are challenges of employment, as the previous speaker talked about, and it is widely known that through media and research reports, there are enormous gaps in demand of workers in regional areas. But the bigger and in most cases, we hear some of the small businesses closing in the regional areas. Some bigger companies prefer to import or to bring workers from overseas. And in most cases, sometimes when we approach the employers, the first conversations are really good. But as we advance into conversations, and as employers sometimes some of the employers get to know the people who are coming, they regress back. And we have always talked to the employers that the best is what they don't see, and that they should always give a chance to migrants and refugees so that they can express the good in them. We believe that in refugees there is resilience, in refugees there is aptitude, in refugees there is gratefulness for the opportunity offered. In them there is empathy and boldness to confront challenges. There is and there is. They just need a chance. I like to cite the example of Aleem, a company of my great friend John Millington and the wife, who instead of closing their wonderful iconic company in the town, decided to approach a refugee settlement organization in Melbourne to secure workers, and the company, which was at the brink of closing back then, is now a flourishing business. I would implore most of the employers to take similar examples so that they can employ refugees and migrants. Some of the other challenges are related to housing, and it needs a concerted efforts to venture into regional accommodation. Funding is another issue into regional areas that we have faced, but I can say that I can thank very much some of the philanthropists who have funded our programs and encourage the government also to invest in refugee-led initiatives. The challenge that we use infrastructure and sustainable settlement in regional areas. It is our humble understanding that one of the reasons for the decline of regional population is the lack of youth-friendly infrastructure that are mostly found in cities. And to de-escalate this challenge, both the government and the corporate community may need to venture into regional infrastructure that will attract and retain youth in the regional areas. Can I say that 56% of the people who've settled in regional areas, in a space of 1.5 to 2 years, they have purchased properties in those regional communities, which is really an impressive progress. Finally, in our experience and observations, the decision to choose Town A as opposed to Town B has a positive correlation between the peaceful past that is entrenched in the peaceful village town of the infancy life of refugees before the sound of guns, machetes, spears, and other weapons kicked those refugees out of their small villages back in their countries. They left behind a mist of ashes of their burning homes, tears, and possibly blood of their loved ones. But that peaceful village town of infant times is the ideal that hangs on the decision to choose their sustainable place of living in regional Australia. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much,